Hi everybody, we're here to talk about chemistry some more. We're going to start today with a discussion about some of the other larger molecules and compounds that we have in our body that are really important to all of the different systems of our body. Let's start here. This is a figure from the textbook that shows the four major important organic compounds in our body. Organic compounds mean that they contain carbon. Water would be an inorganic compound because it's only made of H, hydrogen, and O, oxygen. So let's take a look at this list just as a preview. Carbohydrates are large molecules that are our sugars. They come in lots of different forms, some smaller and some bigger than others. Lipids are the fats in our body. Proteins, we know, are important for forming muscle, but they also have lots of other functions that we'll talk about today as well. And then lastly, nucleic acids. DNA is maybe the most important one of those. That makes up our genetic code, and we'll talk about each of these as we continue. If we start here with carbohydrates, carbohydrates are our sugars. If you look down here at the very bottom, we have the word monosaccharide. Saccharide means sugar. Monosaccharide means single sugar, meaning it's made up of one ring, one sugar ring. So monosaccharides and disaccharides are both small sugars, and here are a couple of examples. One is sucrose. Sucrose is table sugar. Glucose is the sugar that we're going to talk about most that is important for our blood sugar levels. When we talk about blood sugar levels, we're talking about glucose in the bloodstream. Lactose is a small sugar that's made from, or that is found in milk, and maltose is another of these small sugars as well. A lot of the sugars that we have in our body are actually used more for storage. And these storage molecules end up being much, much larger than the mono and the disaccharides that you saw in the previous slide. These are actually made up of long branching structures that contain all of these individual sugars linked together. So we have two options here. We have starch. Starch is the glucose storage molecule found in plants. So when you hear people talk about eating starchy foods, like, say, corn or potatoes, the reason it's considered a starchy food is because it contains large amounts of this starch or this sugar storage molecule. The other major sugar storage molecule that we have in our body, this is the one that's found in animals, and that is glycogen. So if starch is found in plants, glycogen is found in animals. It has the same basic branching structure though, and glycogen is what we use primarily in our liver as we adjust blood sugar levels. Let me erase this really quick so you can see what I'm talking about. When we're dealing with our blood sugar, if we have, let's see, here's the liver, and it contains glycogen because that's where we store a lot of this sugar. Well, if our blood sugar gets low, what happens is that the liver starts to basically chop off individual glucose molecules, and it lets them go out into the blood as individual glucose molecules. Now, if our blood glucose levels get too high, we actually take these glucose molecules, join them back together, and we actually can add them to these long pre-existing chains that are in the liver. So the liver is really great at releasing individual glucose molecules or adding them back in as necessary to keep the blood sugar levels stable. Another one of the larger molecules that we need to talk about are the lipids, and lipids are the fats in our body. We have a few different ones that we're going to focus on, but one of the first things I wanted to show you is that these triglycerides, which is one of the major ones, are hydrophobic. Remember from our previous discussion that things that are hydrophobic are nonpolar. And remember we also showed the diagram of oil and water together. So oil is going to be one of the things where we get triglycerides from. We get triglycerides from all these other sources as well. But triglycerides are the type of lipid that's actually found. We get it in food for sure, but we store it in the form of adipose tissue. So this is an example of a particular type of cell called an adipose cell or a fat cell. Okay, this is the cell membrane, and these are the nuclei for each of those cells. But what happens is that when you have lots of, I'm going to change the color here, when you have lots of excess triglyceride in the body, you end up needing to store it somehow. And so it gets stored in these adipose cells, and it fills up the cell almost completely. That's really about all these cells do, is just store triglycerides. So if you have a lot of extra triglyceride that your body is not needing to use for fuel, you end up storing it in these adipose cells, and these cells get very, very filled with the triglyceride or that fat, and that's where body fat comes from. So triglycerides are a major lipid that we're going to talk about this semester. Also, I'm going to jump to the next slide. Another major lipid that's very important for us is one called a phospholipid. Phospholipids are very important for making up our body cells. Here's an example of a single phospholipid. It's quite interesting because it has what we call a hydrophilic head and two hydrophobic tails. Now, if the head is hydrophilic, does that mean that it's polar or nonpolar? Well, the answer is that the hydrophilic head is polar, and the hydrophobic tails are nonpolar. So the tails act like oil. They're going to do everything they can to avoid the water. The heads are perfectly happy interacting with the water because they already have a charge on them. So what ends up happening is that these tails are so afraid of that water, remember they're hydrophobic, that they will combine with neighboring phospholipids so that they can tuck their tails together and actually avoid all the water. We have lots of water in the extracellular fluid, which means in the fluid outside of our body cells. And we have lots of water in the cytosol, or the inside of our cells. So on either surface we have water. So what these phospholipids do is that they tuck inwards and they form a bilayer. So our cell membranes are made up of two layers of phospholipids. You can see it here too, where the heads face the two edges, either the outside of the cell or the inside of the cell, and then the tails are tucked inside, doing everything they can to avoid the water. So your entire cell would look like this. Here's the circle, and here's the double layer. Polar here, and polar here. And this part in the middle is the nonpolar section. Excuse me. Let's keep going on this one. Proteins. This was our third major organic compound that was listed on the chart below. Sorry, the chart above. And these are some examples. Just to remind you, here's our membrane that we just talked about, made of the phospholipid bilayer with the polar heads here and the nonpolar tails in the middle. So what are some of the things that proteins are used for in our body? Well, we know that they are used mechanically to make things like our muscles move. Actually, our muscle cells are filled with these mechanical proteins that allow for movement. But even at a cellular level, proteins are very important. One is for transport. This figure actually shows you that these proteins, here's an example of one here, these proteins have the job of moving molecules in and out of the cell. Sometimes things might be too big to fit through the middle. Sometimes there might be an issue with charge that would prevent a molecule from moving straight through the phospholipid bilayer, and it might need some help. And it gets that help through structures called protein channels or protein transporters in the membrane. We also have proteins in the membrane that are responsible for receiving information and for what we call cell signaling. Do you remember in the discussion about positive feedback, we talked about a hormone called oxytocin? And oxytocin, remember, was the hormone that went from the brain all the way through the body to the uterus, right? That's a great picture. Well, here's the thing. Oxytocin passes by a lot of other cells and a lot of other organs on its way to the uterus. It's just moving through the blood. Oxytocin doesn't do anything to most of those organs, but to the uterus, oxytocin can trigger muscle contractions. And the reason is that the uterine muscle has receptors on it that are specific for oxytocin, and oxytocin binds and is able to actually cause some type of an action within the cells of the uterus. Other particular organs that don't have a receptor for oxytocin, they just get passed right by, because without a receptor, oxytocin can't do anything at all. These are the major ones we wanted to talk about: the mechanical proteins, transport proteins, and also receptors. All right. The next major compound that we needed to discuss are the nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. So let's take a look at those. DNA is, actually I'm going to draw this really quick. So here's a cell. This part, the center of it, is called the nucleus, and we'll talk about this some more as we go ahead, but let me tell you here that DNA is found inside the nucleus. It is our genetic code. It's what we get from mom and dad. It's what makes us who we are. It's what makes our body function and look the way it does exactly. And this genetic information is housed inside the nucleus. Nucleic acids are made of subunits called nucleotides. It's actually an arrangement of 4 nucleotides: A, T, C, and G. And if you've seen anything about the genetic code, what you see is just a huge repeating unit of any combination of these 4 letters. So these 4 letters in all these combinations really create everything that there is about our body. Now, DNA, one of the major jobs is that it's going to code for what we call these proteins that we discussed earlier. And in order to make protein, well, the machinery that does that is actually out here outside of the nucleus. So in order for that machinery to get the information from the DNA, we have to actually make a copy of DNA, and that's called RNA. And RNA moves out into this cytoplasm, which is this part of the cell out here. And that's where protein gets made. So DNA is found in the nucleus. We have to make an RNA copy to get out here into the cytoplasm so that we can read that RNA to make the protein. One important thing to know is that DNA, we said, has A and T and C and G. These two always, A and T always pair together. C and G always pair together. So if you look at this example of ATCG, if this was one strand of DNA, there would be a complementary strand of DNA that would read T, A, G, C. So DNA is double-stranded. You're going to have both sides. RNA is single-stranded. And instead of having a T, you have a U. So A and U, and then you still have your C and G together. So if we had a strand of DNA that read A, T, C, G, that would be the DNA. The RNA copy would read U, A, G, C. And that would be the part that could move out into the cytoplasm and be used to make your proteins. I hope that makes sense. If you have questions, please let me know, and we will continue this in the next video.